Culture sits in the background of an organisation. It's the collective patterns of behaviour and thinking. It's the rituals. It's the habits. It's kind of like the personality of the organisation. Adrian McLean and Judy Marshall gave a nice formal definition of culture in their paper Intervening in Cultures. They defined culture as the collection of traditions, values, policies, beliefs and attitudes that constitute a pervasive context for everything we do and think in an organisation. In this video, I want to introduce the idea of organisational culture. Culture can make people feel good about their organisation at its best, but at its worst, it can bring people down. It can leave them feel frustrated, upset, even fearful. And we describe an organisational culture as strong if it is both deeply held and held widely amongst a large proportion of the organisation's members. An organisational culture has big consequences for its organisation in terms of things like staff motivation and hence in productivity, in the interactions with other organisations and other people like customers, suppliers, consultants and partner organisations, not to mention regulators and audit organisations. Culture influences choices and decision-making processes, and it creates the methods of control that the organisation uses, both formally and informally, by either facilitating or blocking certain modes of communication. And finally, because culture dictates the way the organisation interacts with society, it also determines the public perception of the organisation. Most often, organisational culture is a reflection of the wider culture within which the organisation sits. Often it amplifies some elements of that culture, but equally it could subvert or even invert some aspects of the wider society. The easiest way to think of how an organisational culture arises is that it arises from how we do things around here. This means that if we can successfully change the modes of operation, the habits of the people in the organisation, then we can also successfully shift the culture of the organisation. In doing this, there are often a small number of informal leaders who will have a disproportionate impact on the way we think about the organisation, on its culture. Their actions, their choices, and indeed their words can often have a huge impact, for good or for ill, on the culture of the organisation. But let's not forget that big organisations, and sometimes small organisations, don't always have a uniform culture throughout the organisation. What we often find is subcultures within different parts of the organisation, reflecting differences in the regional affiliations of the parts of the organisation, or maybe the functional work that they do, or even the divisional leadership and the style that that leadership sets for their division. In many ways, this behaves in just the same way as a national culture. It's common to find different regional subcultures within any one national culture. Indeed, it's not just regions. There are often social cultures within the wider national culture, reflecting differences in values, political affiliations, heritage, religion. All manner of things come together to form a culture, both nationally and within an organisation. And if you're wondering how important organisational culture is, then we need to look to the saying that is often, but I must say without a lot of evidence, attributed to Peter Drucker. The saying, "culture eats strategy for breakfast," suggests that no matter how good your strategy is, if it is not consistent with the culture of the organisation, then that strategy is likely to fail. The truth, of course, is that culture and strategy are both important. And what really matters is that the one is aligned with the other. If you need to shift the organizational strategy significantly, then you will need to do work to shift the culture accordingly. The upshot of all of this is that understanding organizational culture is important for any manager, particularly if you're involved in change or in the strategy of the organization. So in the series of videos that follow this one, we'll be looking at what different authors and thinkers have come up with as ways of understanding organizational culture. The cultural web of an organization is a simple model developed by Jerry Johnson and Kevin Scholes. And it helps us to understand 7 important factors that have an impact on an organization's culture. At the core of the model, at the center of the web, is paradigm. And the paradigm represents the set of assumptions that everyone in the organization, or most people in the organization, make about the organization. If you like, it's the working model of the organization that people hold in their heads. Next, we have the symbols, the outward indicators of the organization itself. These are things like brand, terminology, the perks that people get, like company cars, the titles that people use, the most visible things to the outside world. When you go into an organization, what do you see on the walls? Typically, you see logos, you see colors, you see imagery. All of these are the symbols that both reflect the organizational culture and reinforce it, setting the tone. They can be as simple as color. A bright golden color suggests a happy, easygoing culture, whereas a dark blue color might reflect a more thoughtful, cautious, considered organization. Next, we have the power structures of the organization. And these are both the formal hierarchies within the organization, the reporting lines, the organization chart, who's in charge of whom, and the informal networks that sit inside that hierarchy, which reflect how work gets done day to day. Both of these have a huge impact on the culture of the organization. The organizational structures often drive the formal power structures that we just talked about. These are the formal relationships between functions, activities, people, and budgets. Typically, this is the diagram that is presented to the outside world, to shareholders, to customers, and to regulators. Next, we have control structures. These are the means by which the organization measures and rewards performance. And indeed, it sets up what aspects of performance are likely to be rewarded and what are likely to be deprecated and therefore potentially punished. Rituals and routines set out what we do and how we do it. They regulate everything from the processes of the organization through to the interactions between people. And finally, we have stories. And these are the events and the people that the organization remembers. When an organization tries to take control of its culture, it tries to choose what events it remembers and marks in its history, and what personalities it sets aside as heroes or villains, creators or implementers. And it also determines which lessons we learn from the events that we consider to be either successes or failures. When you ask people who are deeply steeped in the culture of an organization about their organization, these are the stories they will tell. We can use Johnson and Scholes' cultural web model for understanding how a culture operates and what drives it. But more importantly, we can also use it to understand how we might shift a culture from where it is now to where we want it to be in the future. Once we've understood that current state and the future state that we want, we can start to think about the changes we need to make to each of these factors to bridge the gap that takes us from now to where we want to get to. So the Johnson and Scholes model is not just about understanding a static culture. It's about figuring out the levers we need to apply to shift our culture and therefore to set up the conditions for the future success of our organisation. Edgar Schein of the Sloan School of Management was interested in organisational culture, and he produced what is perhaps the best known and most widely used model. He divided organisational culture into 3 levels: artifacts, values, and assumptions. And that's what we'll look at in this video. Schein's 3 levels, artifacts, values, and assumptions, are rather like an iceberg, in that the most important bits are the parts you can't see. However, the bit you can see, the bit above the waterline, were the artifacts. Artifacts are the visible, surface elements of an organisational culture. They're what an outside observer would easily see. In this way, they are pretty similar to the symbols of the Johnson and Scholes model, which we looked at in another video. Typical examples include branding, furniture, colours, dress code, day-to-day rituals, job titles, and to incorporate something else that Scholes distinguished, stories. The stories that people tell about their organisation are artifacts of the organisation and readily visible to outsiders. Whilst artifacts are easy to observe, they can sometimes be difficult to understand because there's a lot of deeper stuff going on, and we need to excavate below that level to properly understand an organisational culture. Stories give us a good example of this, because whilst there are stories that are told outside of the organisation, there are quite possibly other stories that are only told inside the organisation, and they drive these deeper levels. But critically, it's the interpretation of these stories, what they mean, which give rise to the values and the assumptions of the organisation. The second level, therefore, is the espoused values of the organisation. These are the declared sets of values that the organisation has and the norms of behaviour it expects of its members. As a result, they set out what should be done, how we should do it, and the choices we should make. Values dictate the way that the members of the organisation interact with one another, behave, and represent their organisation to the outside world. The organisation often amplifies these espoused values by public statements, visible symbols if you like, such as statements of values or organisational strap lines that go with their branding and their identity. But underpinning everything are the shared basic assumptions about the organisation, the deep interpretations of the stories we tell about ourselves. These are the beliefs that people take for granted about the organisation. They often go unnoticed and are rarely even questioned. They're very similar to Johnson and Scholes' paradigm. But if you want to understand the artifacts of an organisation, and indeed the values it sets out, then you need to get to grips with the shared assumptions. In 1985, Edgar Schein described 6 basic types of assumption that together would form what Johnson and Scholes would describe as the organisational paradigm. These are assumptions about the truth and how we determine it, the importance of time and the extent to which we respect it and how we choose to use it, how space within the organisation is owned and allocated, and the respect that people give to it. There are assumptions about human nature, whether people are inherently good or bad, whether people can change, or whether behaviour is fixed. This isn't an academic discussion about what is right. It's a set of assumptions that are held within the organisation which drive its choices and its culture. The fifth type of assumption is very important in the modern world. It's the relationship between the organisation and its environment, and indeed between the organisation's members and their environment. And you can see how this can drive some very important decisions which are going to drive public perceptions and therefore are going to be intrinsic to the future success of many organisations. And finally, there are a whole set of assumptions around social power and how people should relate to one another. And yes, that social power term links closely to the French and Raven social power bases that we looked at in another video. Assumptions about social power dictate a lot of behaviours, like how power and responsibilities are allocated within the organisation, and the extent to which that power is respected. The balance between cooperation and competition within the organisation, the extent to which individuals are minded to collaborate with one another or to operate on their own, and therefore the styles of leadership which people expect and the ways that we resolve conflict and make decisions. Edgar Schein's 3 levels offer us a simpler way to understand how organisations work than Johnson and Scholl's 7 components. However, that simplicity makes it really easy for us to understand how the model works and to use it day to day. Because recognising a culture means recognising that below the visible, easy to grasp artefacts are deeper shared values and very deep assumptions which are driving the culture. And what this tells us is that if you really want to shift a culture, you have to shift the assumptions that underpin everything. It might be that changing some of the artifacts is a way to do this, but fundamentally, if you can't shift assumptions, you cannot change culture. Robert Quinn and Kim Cameron created a model of 4 organisational cultures. It's called a competing values framework because it is based on 2 pairs of opposite values. The first pair of competing values are stability and flexibility, the competition between more controlling organisations and more agile ones. The second pair of competing values are an inward-looking focus and an outward-looking focus, concerns for internal matters or external matters. This gives us a classic 2x2 4-box model, which we'll look at in this video. Quinn and Cameron give us 4 distinct quadrants or cultural types. And the first of these is the clan culture. This culture is collaborative and nurturing. Members of the organisation see themselves as part of one big family. Within this culture, leadership takes a light touch, with a large emphasis on coaching and mentoring and support and guidance. Clan culture organisations tend to be values-driven with strong traditions. And the values that they tend to espouse are things like teamwork, collaboration and support. The watchword for a clan culture is let's do it together. The adhocracy culture is outward and flexible, energetic, creative and entrepreneurial. Employees within an adhocracy culture feel like it's okay to take risks. And leaders tend to be the most innovative and entrepreneurial people in the organisation. To facilitate this, the organisation encourages experimentation and gives individuals freedom to innovate and do as they see fit. Core values reflect the need for innovation, change and agility. The watchwords for an adhocracy culture are let's do it first. Quinn and Cameron's hierarchy culture is inward and stable. It has a strong structure and tends to exert a high degree of control over its members and the things that they do. The work environment tends to be formal with strict procedures, processes and policies. So the role of leadership is largely around coordinating the work and monitoring performance. The values that matter are efficiency, predictability, consistency, uniformity. This is, if you like, the precise opposite of the adhocracy culture. The result is that change is very slow in hierarchical organisations, and you should recognise this description in many bureaucratic and governmental organisations. For them, the watchwords are let's do it right. Quinn and Cameron's fourth type of organisation has a market culture. It is outward focused and stable. It is focused on competing with other organisations and achieving results, which means that leaders have to be tough, competitive and assertive. The organisation comes together around a common goal of beating its rivals. And sometimes to do this, leaders feel they have to be demanding of the time and the energy of their staff. Everything in market organisations is driven by a need for market share and profitability. So their watchwords are something like, let's just do it. Quinn and Cameron have argued that flexible organisations are more successful in the modern world than their more rigid, stable cousins. And this is because they can adapt more readily to changing circumstances. They can accommodate different subcultures within the organisation that are needed to address particular problems. Because while an organisation may have one dominant culture, it's almost certain that in a big organisation, different departments, different parts of the organisations will have different subcultures with different positions among these competing values. For example, one might expect an accounting department to have a strongly hierarchical culture, whilst the development team may work much better with an adhocracy culture. Quinn and Cameron's model is an easy one to understand. It takes two of the most important values axes and gives us four very simple, very easy to recognise cultural types. If you want to think about what the culture is for your organisation and for the different parts of your organisation, this is a great model to start with. Edgar Schein was a professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and his greatest contribution to our understanding of organisations is his model of the 3 layers of culture that sit within an organisation. And we'll look at that in much more detail in a later video. For now though, all you really need to know is what those 3 levels are. The base layer is the underlying beliefs that underpin the organisation, the shared assumptions that members of the organisation hold. In the middle layer, you find the values that people within the organisation hold and work to. And at the top layer are the artefacts that we can easily see and experience. Indeed, even an external observer can see and experience those artefacts. This is the bit of the organisational culture that is very much on show. Therefore, it's at this most superficial level that we can easily detect the major differences in the organisational model. So, in this video, we'll look at 2 opposing cultural models that Schein defined. And these will give us our first and simplest introduction to the wide range of organisational models that we'll be looking at in later videos. The two models that Schein defined are both simple to understand and easy to recognise, and they will be familiar to most people. Because of that, the many more detailed models that we'll look at in later videos are really just elaborations, variations, amplifications of these two base models. Schein discussed these two models in a 1984 article in the Sloan Management Review. The article was called Coming to a New Awareness of Organizational Culture, and he labelled these two models as the individual freedom ethic and the authority ethic. And with those simple labels, we immediately understand what the big differences are about. In the individual freedom ethic, ideas come primarily from the individual, and each person is responsible for their own actions and for motivating themselves. Individuals within the organisation get at the right answers. They discover the truth by discussing things and fighting things out between themselves, and that's possible because everyone feels comfortable within the organisation, that they are respected and part of some community or family, as Schein described them. In organisations with an individual freedom ethic, therefore, people feel safe to compete with one another, to debate, to discuss, and to argue their point. As a result, we find artifacts such as informality. We find open office doors. Indeed, we often find open plan offices where people are comfortable wandering around and starting conversations as the need arises. Standards of dress may still be formal, but they tend towards the informal. And certainly there are lower levels of formality in the way that people address one another. There may be a hierarchy, but people don't feel inhibited by the hierarchy in their social interactions. The polar opposite of this culture is one of an authority ethic. In organisations with a strong authority ethic, it's felt that wisdom and the right answers come from more senior individuals who are perhaps better educated, longer serving, and certainly have higher levels of status within the organisation. As a result, the hierarchical structure is emphasised within authority cultures. Reporting lines and therefore relationships are often linear and vertical up through the organisation. And there are high levels of deference to rank, authority, experience, age, and perceived wisdom. There are often high levels of loyalty to individuals within organisations that have an authority ethic, but each individual within that organisation tends to stick very much within their own niche. Often there are boundaries around job roles which are highly respected. The organisation itself will often take a paternalistic view of its employees, seeing it as its job to take care of them. In return, it expects high levels of loyalty and compliance. The artifacts we see in this sort of organisation are, of course, all of the trappings of formality, highly formal workwear, highly respectful and formalised relationships between individuals, often a quiet working environment with closed office doors. Rank and position in the hierarchy are important to everyone. Often, even if you only need a short and simple conversation, you will need to make an appointment. Of course, there's a spectrum. These two archetypes merely represent the extreme ends of that spectrum, and most organisations exist somewhere on it. And the other thing I would say is that there seems to be a shift in time. Back at the first half of the 20th century, we would have expected almost every organisation to have something of the authority ethic. Now, in the early 21st century, we find a lot of organisations, particularly the newer organisations, have a far stronger individual freedom ethic. But there's also an important factor of the culture within which the organisation sits. Because organisations in some countries will tend towards one extreme, whilst organisations in other countries will tend to the other extreme. And certainly newer startup organisations are almost entirely of an individual freedom ethic. But the important thing to note about these two types of organisational culture and the spectrum of options in the middle is that none is right and none is wrong. What really matters is how well the organisational culture and the model it drives is suited to the needs of the organisation, what it's trying to do, and the culture within which it is trying to do it. Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. There's loads more great management courses content to come, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of it. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, keep learning.